If you watched any of my interviews over the last couple of years about electricity systems, power grids in North America, you'll know that I often talk about how innovative and how disruptive the U.S. power grid is and how much innovation is going on there in terms of bringing in intermittent renewables, in terms of adopting new technologies, in terms of expanding the grid, because there's a recognition that as the economies get electrified, the economies like the US will need 2 to 3 times as much electricity. How are you going to generate it? How are you going to move it around on the grid? What needs to be, how much more transmission do you need? These are all issues that the Americans are grappling with, and the Canadians are not. We're a little behind the curve on that point. So I'm going to talk to Osmand Tsang, who is the Regional Vice President of Utility Sales for Hitachi Energy. And we're going to talk about what's going on in the US, and then maybe comment a little bit about Western Canada, about Canada, why we're behind the Americans. So welcome to the interview, Osmand.
Thanks so much, Markham. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for the
thank you for being for coming to the interview. Now, give me a brief overview of just what's going on in the US and why there's so much disruption and change there.
Sure, I'd be happy to. As I'm sure you know, the US infrastructure is quite old. It was built predominantly in the 1950s and the 1960s, and the entire US infrastructure is built for power to flow one way: generation, transmission to distribution, and where the consumers are at. And so with all of the changes that are going on right now in electrification, the grid has to rapidly change its design from a unidirectional flow to a bidirectional flow. You're going to be moving power back and forth, along the same transmission lines, and it's going to vary. There's a lot less predictability now than there ever was before as the market changes. So that's one of the reasons why US utilities are scrambling like crazy to try to make the grid smarter and change the actual design of the grid itself to be able to allow power to flow more freely and quickly back and forth as opposed to just one direction.
Yeah, I hear a lot of discussion about the regional planning in the US and movement, the development of markets in the various states, and the ability to move electricity back and forth depending on who needs it, when and where,
Yes.
And how important that's going to be to grapple with intermittent renewables. What about distributed energy, and which is renewables, but there's the emergence of microgrids, there's the emergence of battery storage in a big way on the American grid. How is that affecting this innovation that you were just describing?
Oh, well, that's a great question, Markham. What has to happen is that we have to make the grid smarter. That's the biggest thing, right? We have to make the grid more intelligent. Right? We have to be able to make decisions faster. And so the software that goes to operating the grid, transmission and distribution level, needs to be able to process more data, and it has to be able to process it faster. And that's why digitization is such a big part of the transformation of the electrical grid. We're going to need more artificial intelligence, more sensors, more high-level processing and analytics to be able to move the power so the grid doesn't collapse under itself. Now that it's become less predictable with regards to who needs the energy, when, and who can supply it and when. Those are really complex calculations. And without good computing technology and artificial intelligence, it's impossible for us to be able to manage it quickly.
Now, it seems to me that this is a good timing for grid engineers, because the big data and analytics has been around for a couple of decades. Manufacturing was transformed already. Other industries have been transformed by it. And this is interesting to me because the oil and gas industry was also late to this game, but is now adapting very quickly and adopting, things like AI and predictive analytics and so on. So is that actually an advantage for the Americans, because they have all of this, it's not like the software is in its infancy. There's experience around it. We've all got very powerful, cheap computers. The cloud is around for storage, all of that kind of thing. Does that actually does that enable the kind of rapid change that we're seeing in the United States?
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why we as Hitachi Energy are really excited about the transformation and the pace in which it's going. You mentioned just a few minutes ago about how exciting it is to be the energy. I feel that. I really, really do. I've never seen so much excitement. I personally have never been so excited to be in the energy space because we're seeing new things, new innovations coming into the market at a pace that we've never seen before. Historically, the utility sector, the energy sector, the oil and gas sector have moved rather slowly. They've been very conservative because the most important thing for the grid is reliability. And so they don't ever want to disturb reliability. And now what we're seeing is that if they aren't able to make these changes quickly enough, the entire reliability of the grid is going to basically collapse on itself. And so you're absolutely correct. The availability now of applying, artificial intelligence to the control of the grid does require some research. Absolutely. I mean, we understand the importance of cybersecurity, and the importance of the grid, to our national infrastructure and security. We've got to do it in an intelligent way. But you're absolutely correct. All the capability is there, and now we just need to learn how to apply it, deploy it in a safe manner that secures the grid.
I want to run a little hypothesis by you that a pet hypothesis of mine that maybe explains the difference between Canada and the US. The Canadian power grid, and really power grids, because we're talking about 10 provinces and 3 territories, and they all have their own grids that aren't necessarily connected or connected much. But the point here is that we've got 60% hydro, we've got 17% nuclear, we've got some wind and solar. We're 80% clean already. Our rates are low in most provinces. They're very reliable. We're almost a victim of our own success because we just haven't felt the pressure to do the kind of innovation that the Americans are doing because we've been so successful in building out these reliable, clean grids, for decades already. Is that a reasonable hypothesis or not?
Very much so, yes. I mean, province to province, you'll see a different mix of generation capacity that is quote unquote greener. But I would agree with that. My region that I run is the West. And so I've got 4 of the provinces and 3 territories. It's a very diverse provincial makeup, when it comes to the region that I run. And you're absolutely right. I think, each province has its own unique challenges with regards to meeting, our greenhouse gas emission targets. If you look at British Columbia, for example, where you and I both live, it's, 85, 90% hydro, right? Plus a few other distributed generation sources. So really, they don't need to convert a lot of coal-fired generation like they do in, say, Saskatchewan, right? They've done a very, very good job of planning out their energy infrastructure from a generation point of view. So every province has to tackle a little bit differently. And I think that's one of the reasons why in Canada, things have been a little bit slower right now in terms of adopting to the new architecture of the grid. Every province is trying to figure out their own path rather than having a unified sort of approach to it. And that does tend to slow things down a bit.
Now, I know the federal government wants the provinces to work more closely together. There was talk of a pan-Canadian grid council, though we're not sure where that is these days. It seems to have kind of quietly disappeared. But nevertheless, I mean, there is some interest from the federal government in facilitating more east-west trade, particularly between the hydro provinces of BC and Manitoba and the province in the middle, Alberta and Saskatchewan. And do you see any interest in that amongst policymakers in those various provinces? Are they starting to have conversations about more of a regional market and more east-west trade?
There is some, Markham, that's a very good question. It is a bit challenging one, right? And it has to do with the fact that energy is provincially regulated. It's not federally regulated, right? But the environment is federally regulated. So we have a bit of a disconnect right at the start, right, with regards to the federal government looking to initiate and execute on national programs to help with decarbonization. And the energy market plays a big part of that. But they don't have the power to force, any type of interprovincial regulations. The provinces themselves control their own energy resources, and for good reason. So it is a very difficult conversation to have, since every single province has its own sort of unique energy mix, as we talked about before. And that does put a lot of pressure, right, on how do we go about forming a more broader national energy sort of policy or approach. I can say with great honesty that the provinces are talking a lot, at least in the West, about strengthening all the interties between the various provinces. But without some sort of, I think, a federal program or incentive to actually build or develop a stronger east-west energy corridor or infrastructure, it is going to be a little bit more difficult because every province is going to have to try to figure out its own challenges in connecting with one another.
Yeah, I mean, you see down in the US, they've got regional planning councils, and so they can do regional planning. Then they have FERC, Federal Energy Resource Commission, and Regulation Commission, sorry, that then has some federal powers over power transmission and so on. Yeah. So they have the institutions available, the planning institutions and structure to be able to do that on a level that Canada has never done, and now is playing catch up.
That is exactly it. For, I think, that vision to come to reality, we in Canada would need to develop some sort of a structure similar to that, so that it gives us the infrastructure to really talk earnestly, about collaborating province to province and strengthening, I think, the interties between all the different provinces. You're absolutely correct.
Well, great. Osmand, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Oh, no, you're very welcome. Thanks so much for having me, Mark.